Good evening. My name is Jocelyn Wong. I am the Director of Community Engagement here at the Nantucket Historical Association. This evening, we will be hearing from author, educator, and NHA Research Fellow, Barbara Ann White. Barbara was a history teacher here at the Nantucket Public Schools for 33 years. She holds a master's degree in African American Studies from Boston University, as well as a master's degree in Educational Administration from the University of Lancaster in England. Barbara received a Rockefeller Foundation scholarship in 1978, which funded her research in African American history on Nantucket. Her research resulted in the book A Line in the Sand, The Battle to Integrate Nantucket's Public Schools, 1825 to 1847. Barbara wrote 3 more books about Nantucket history after retiring, one of which was published by the NHA after her time as an NHA Research Fellow. Barbara continues to research and write, sharing her passion and expertise with the public through articles and programs like tonight's lecture. So tonight, Barbara will introduce us to Eunice Ross, a remarkable young African-American woman who was instrumental in the integration of the Nantucket High School system. In 1839, at the age of 17, Eunice Ross passed the entrance exam required to attend Nantucket High School. However, the school committee rejected her admission solely based on her race. Her application set off a 6-year struggle to integrate Nantucket Public Schools. Barbara will discuss Ross's interest in political issues of race and gender before and after the school integration controversy, evidenced by her signature on petitions to the Massachusetts State House. She will also include the history of the Ross family and flesh out a fuller picture of what her life might have looked like after the intense public scrutiny after her quest to attend Nantucket High School. So this lecture was organized and scheduled to provide the Nantucket community with a framework for understanding the historical significance of an event that will take place at the 2024 Nantucket High School graduation next week. So the NHA is partnering with the Museum of African American History, the town of Nantucket, and the Nantucket Public Schools to present a posthumous honorary diploma to Eunice Ross at the graduation. The presentation of Ross's honorary diploma will be led by Dr. Elizabeth Hallett, the NPS superintendent, and accepted by former Nantucket High School graduate and Director of Culture and Tourism for the town, Chantal Blas-Murthy. During the NHS graduation ceremony, you can watch this really pivotal event in history, Friday, June 14th, and you all are welcome to join. So without further ado, I will welcome Barbara Ann White to the stage.
When the NHA asked me to do this particular speech, at first I was a little reluctant because I've told the story about the integration a fair amount, and a lot of the faces I see out in the audience already know that story. On the other hand, for newcomers, you have to tell some of that story. And I thought, well, that's going to be kind of a short speech because we don't know a lot about Eunice Ross. So what I thought I would do was to do a little more digging about her family, and that's what this talk is going to be about. I'm going to talk today about the evidence of what is definitely known about her life, but I will digress from what I usually do, which is as a historian to stick to the facts. I've never been tempted to wander into historical fiction, a genre I really don't like, because I like to know what's real and what isn't. In this talk, however, I will digress a bit, and I will make what I'm calling informed conjecturing. I'm going to use Eunice's first name because somehow, over the years, I feel like I know her. I've been acquainted with Eunice in a personal way since 1978, when I discovered her signature on a petition which is in front of you, which had been misfiled at the state archives. I was on sabbatical from the Nantucket Public Schools pursuing my master's in African American Studies at Boston University, and I'd been reading, I had to do a history paper, and so I started reading about African American history on the islands, and I started by reading the Enquirers starting in around 1900, I think it was actually 1819. So I had come across references in the newspapers to petitions, but I really didn't know. As I say, this was just a history paper. I didn't have that much time to devote just to that one class, but I knew it had to do with the Black community here. So during the blizzard of 1978, I couldn't get home, and school was closed for quite a while, and I made my way down to the state archives, which at the time were at the State House in Boston. I went to the archivist on duty, and she was less than warm to see me. She asked me to specify what committee and what petitions I was looking for and what the dates were, and I said I really didn't know, and she said, well, if we're going to go to the vaults, you have to fill out the month and the year and the committee. So I sat there, and she gave me a pile of slips, and I just began filling them out. December, I think I started with 1838, and then I just kept going. And then I didn't know the committees they even had, so I thought, well, I'll say judicial and educational. So I was filling out the slips, and I think she felt I had very little knowledge, which was true. And then a man came on duty while she went to lunch. I like to refer to research as perseverance and serendipity, and this was a case of serendipity. A man came in to cover for her when she went to lunch, and as I was the only person in the place, he asked me what I was doing, and I told him. He listened while I told him about my vague request to find petitions to an unknown committee by some unknown people at unknown dates to an unknown committee, and I wasn't even sure they had gone to the State House. So he asked me if I wanted to go down into the vaults. I, of course, jumped at the chance, and down we went into the basement, the depths of the State House, down an elevator, where there were hundreds of floor-to-ceiling metal shelves filled with vertical files that you see used for magazine collections. He suggested we start with the Education Committee, and we went to that section for the 1840s. He reached above my head and pulled down the first file, and petitions dropped at my feet. I bent to pick them down, and these petitions had never been put into the box. They had sat underneath for, I have no idea how many years, but a long time. When I looked at what was in my hand, I immediately recognized Nantucket names because I had been studying the people. It's really hard to tell you how thrilling a moment that was for me. And that was in the first box we had even pulled out. There were 6 petitions, all from Nantucket. Petitions in those days were often signed in long strips that were put together. I often liken it to a roll of toilet paper because they were signed in different places, so you would take yours and you'd get them signed. And also, when they put them together, they were often taped. They looked pretty impressive. If you could, send this long petition. But it was the 6th petition that is the most important. It was written by Eunice Ross, and she told the story of her being denied admission to the high school despite being, quote, amply qualified. I regret that I never got the gentleman's name who made my discovery possible, but he made my discovery from a routine research paper for my history class into something important that the Department of African American History at Boston University asked for a Rockefeller grant, and then they published my thesis. So that was sort of the smoking gun that showed that Nantucket had been responsible for the 1845 law to ensure equal access to education for all children. Thus began my relationship with Eunice Ross. Most of you know the story. I'm going to condense it. She had been a student at the one-room African school taught by Anna Gardner, who was only 20 when she began teaching there in 1836. 3 years later, her star pupil, Eunice Ross, took the entrance exam, and as you know, she was denied admission. This petition is the only glimpse we have of Eunice Ross's side of the story, the only writing we have from her other than her signature on various petitions, like this one. But it doesn't take much imagination to put ourselves in her shoes, as the storm that her denial unleashed was violent. Imagine being a teenager and the subject of numerous articles on the floor of town meeting, and being the subject of contentious school committee meetings over 6 years. She was the subject of multiple letters to our local newspapers, many of which were ugly. The Black community rallied to her defense, and as the story unfolded, to the defense of some other young Black children who were later denied entrance to the town's 2 grammar schools, which is too long a sidebar to go into here. Whole meetings were devoted solely to the subject of the school committee, and as they went back and forth as to whether to admit African American children to the public schools. The elections became fraught over the issue, and her own father, James Ross, ran in 1842 to be on the school committee along with 9 other men from New Guinea. Furthermore, the island's annual summer conventions of the Anti-Slavery Society put segregation of Nantucket schools in the limelight, and papers across New England carried the story, most in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, published by William Lloyd Garrison. Thus, the true story of Eunice Ross became material for famous off-island abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and C. Lennox Remond, all familiar with Eunice's story. It's likely that she met them all. I think it would be hard to believe that she didn't. Let's look at a few examples of the kinds of things that the local papers printed for everyone to read. On the front page of the Inquirer, Black abolitionist C. Lennox Remond wrote, "On your island of Nantucket, has the voice of the people been heard in town meeting assembled, refusing a well-qualified colored girl her place in the high school? Your citizens, in their corporate capacity, conspire against the individual rights of a single member, and that be it said to the shame of the conspirators in the person of a helpless girl." I'm not sure Eunice would have agreed with being a helpless girl, but that was the wording. Over a period of 4 months in 1843, there were a series of point and counterpoint letters in the Inquirer, with the pseudonym B arguing in favor of integration and Fair Play arguing against. B, we know, was Nathaniel Barney. We do not know who Fair Play was. Theirs were not the only letters to the paper, but they best exemplify the arguments being bandied about in town. An excerpt from Fair Play's first letter gives you a sample of what Eunice had to read. "I propose a word on the propriety of mixing white and colored children in our schools. I am opposed to it. First, because it would inflict a permanent injury upon the schools, injuring both the white and colored children." He wrote that integrated schooling would lead to interracial marriage, which he declared, quote, "contrary to the laws of nature," even offensively writing that Black people have a, quote, "peculiar odor." A few weeks later, Nathaniel Barney wrote an answer to each of Fair Play's arguments. In it, he wrote, "Why was Eunice F. Ross refused her place in the high school? Did she enjoy an equal privilege with the 17 who were admitted when she was examined, none of whom was so well qualified as herself?" Fair Play wrote in a later letter, "To my knowledge, this girl never had a place in the high school. The school committee undoubtedly refused her admission to that school on account of her color. And this it was their duty to do for any peculiarity so obnoxious to the great mass." These letters went on for weeks. In one, Barney wrote, "Everybody knows the injustice which was done that girl, and if she had been the daughter of some of our citizens, nay, if she had been the daughter of Fair Play, he would have known it, but she was the daughter of an obscure colored man." Can you imagine how this attention and focus in a small town like ours affected a teenager when she was recognized everywhere she went, and how it affected her family? Is it any wonder that it appears that Eunice was a virtual hermit for the rest of her life? Trying to piece together the rest of her life is difficult. The last hard evidence we have of the rest of her life, the last hard evidence we have of her is her signature in 1858 on a petition for equal suffrage submitted by her former teacher Anna Gardner with 277 other Nantucketers. When Eunice signed that petition, she was 35 years old, and we have no idea what she had been doing since then and since she had been denied admission to the high school. And that's the last signature we have of hers. She is listed in the 1860 census as 37 and living with her parents and a nephew. The only nephew alive then was James G. Ross. More on him later. No occupation is ever listed for Eunice in any census, and it appears she never worked. It's possible she took in laundry or needlework. I think it's possible she tutored children, but we don't know. There is a tantalizing note in the New England Freedmen's Aid Society records in Boston that simply says, September 25, 1865, from Anna Gardner that E. Ross cannot go to Maryland. Anna Gardner had gone to New Bern during the Civil War to teach freedmen. Anna came home for the summer in 1865 when that note was written. My guess is that Anna approached Eunice to join the NEFAS teaching corps that funded teachers throughout the South. It certainly would have been a dangerous assignment. Maryland was a long way from Nantucket, and the Civil War had just ended. We don't know if Eunice had any experience traveling or being away from her family. She was 42 and had no teaching experience that we know of. I don't think it's surprising that she declined. Eunice disappears from the censuses of 1870 and 1880. It's likely she was missed, but it is also possible she had gone somewhere else. I would like to think she may have gone visiting or even keeping house for her nephew, James Gardner Ross, in one of the places he was living during this time, when he was in Boston or New Haven. But this is pure conjecture on my part, but it is a possibility. There's just one more reference to Eunice Ross, which comes decades later in her obituary at age 72 in 1895. It recounted the story of Eunice being denied admission to the high school at, quote, a time when the color line was closely drawn in the public schools. It ends by saying she was an apt scholar, and Miss Gardner had advanced her until she was qualified for entrance to the high school, where she was made application for admission. Miss Ross was particularly fond of the study of French, a language in which she became proficient. This indicates that Eunice continued to study throughout her life, including learning French. How did she support herself? It had to have come down, in my thinking, to her family. We know she lived with her parents for a while. Perhaps it was in their house that she remained. We know that she was close to her sister Sarah, the two buried next to each other in twin headstones at the historic colored cemetery. This choice must have been made by Sarah, as Eunice had died before her. It is through her family, I think, that we can form a picture of what Eunice's life was like after having been in the spotlight. As the fifth child born to James Ross and Mary Pompey Ross, Eunice was the baby of her family. Her oldest sibling was already 15 when she was born. Not much is known about her parents. However, unusually, James Ross had been born in Africa. We do not know when or how he got to the island, whether he had been previously enslaved, or where the name Ross came from. Did he come on a whale ship? Did he make his way out of the South or from somewhere else in New England? It is intriguing to think about what James might have told his family about his life in Africa. How much, if anything, did he remember? We will never probably know the answer to that, but it is unlikely that he came here voluntarily. But unless he was a small child, it's hard to think he wouldn't have talked about what he remembered of his life to his children. We do know that he worked with wood from a notice he placed in the Enquirer in 1836. He noted that, quote, despite excruciating disease, rheumatism, he respectfully informs his friends and the public at large that he continues to act as usual in his professional sphere. He ends with, quite humorously, I think, the rheumatic friends of the undersigned are particularly requested to bear in mind that his rates of charges remain unaltered. It was noted that he signed with an X and that he sawed wood at his residence, which is listed as number 1999 New Guinea. This disadvantage of illiteracy undoubtedly made him committed to his children's education, and I assume that all his children attended school at some point. James married Mary Pompey, tying him to one of the prominent African-American families of Nantucket. We know little about Mary Pompey, who died in 1855, aged between 75 and 78. Ages are vague sometimes here because the censuses don't always match up with what is in their obituaries, so you have to to be willing that they're a little bit vague. Eunice was 32 when her mother died. Eunice's father, James, was politically active, his name appearing on some petitions, and as I mentioned before, he ran for the school committee. The next year, 1843, he ran to be a town assessor. No black man was ever elected, and it is not clear that they voted or attended town meetings. James Ross died in 1856 when Eunice was 33, 1 year after the death of her mother, possibly leaving her alone in their house. The Inquirer reported that James was about 80 at the time of his death, his funeral held at Zion's Church. Again, the ages don't perfectly align. Now to Eunice's siblings. Sarah M. Ross was 4 years older than Eunice. She most likely contributed to Eunice's support. Sarah and Eunice's signatures appear together on quite a few petitions in their youth. We can imagine them engaging in discussions as teenagers as they put their names to a variety of issues pertaining to civil rights, such as the right to interracial marriage and equal treatment on the railroads. And of course, they must have been huge support for each other during the time of controversy over school integration. Sarah appears in 3 censuses, noted as being in service to and living with the Benjamin Coffin family. When Sarah died, her obituary's first words were, "faithful servant." It said that she had been, quote, "the faithful servant and friend of the Coffins for 57 years," adding that after the death of the elder Coffins, Sarah remained, quote, "an inmate of their home every season during the annual visits of the extended family." Furthermore, it said, although the infirmities of age have incapacitated her for actual labor for several years, yet has she remained an esteemed member of the household and a remarkable example of the faithful friend and servitor, covering a period of 63 years. Did Sarah and Eunice live together during the off-season when the extended family was not on the island? Sarah was 77 at her death. If the numbers are accurate, Sarah entered into service when she was 14. Like Eunice, she remained single. Their next eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was 6 years older than Eunice, 2 older than Sarah. Elizabeth married William Miller, about whom I know nothing. The couple had a daughter, Martha B. Miller, and they had her in 1844. Martha appears in the 1850 census, noted as living with her grandparents, but William and Elizabeth do not. Is it possible her parents had died or moved away? I don't know. The only petition that Elizabeth signed was in 1838, alongside that of her younger sisters Eunice and Sarah. My guess is that Martha B. Miller lived not only with her grandparents, but also her Aunt Eunice, who was only 27 at the time. Martha Miller is listed in the 1880 census, age 36, as a, quote, live-in servant in the Baker family, following in her Aunt Sarah's footsteps as a household domestic. Martha shows up in the 1895 and 1900 censuses. The latter indicates she lived with her Aunt Maria, who I haven't got to yet, on York Street. Perhaps Eunice lived with them as well, or maybe she was in her parents' house. Either way, the sisters lived in the same neighborhood, if not the same house, and I can imagine them having dinners together, holidays together, and attending church together. Martha died in 1913 at the age of 69, having fallen on hard times. Her property was sold at auction by the town's poor department, which had taken possession of it, undoubtedly because she had been the recipient of the town's charity. It sold for $100. This brings us to Eunice's oldest sister, Maria, 8 years older than Eunice. Hers was a life marked by multiple tragedies. She married William Whippy at the South Congregational Church, now the Unitarian Church, in 1837. She was 22, he was 36. They were married by African-American minister, Reverend J.W. Robinson. William Whippy was born in New Zealand, evidently the son of a Maori woman and a Nantucket whaler, possibly from the white Whippy family. Maria and William operated one of New Guinea's boarding houses that catered to mariners of color, called the Kanaka Boarding House. It is interesting that in this slide, Whippy is spelled one way, and in the next slide, it's spelled another way. So I guess the E was optional. The couple's first child, Mary, died in 1838, 1 year after their marriage when the baby was only 2 months old. A few years later, Maria gave birth to a son, William Jr. 8 years later, an unnamed infant son died of tuberculosis. Sadly, the next year, Maria's husband, William, died, also from tuberculosis, when he was 46. Thus, at the age of 32, Maria was a widow. Tragically, their only child, William Jr., died 3 years later, the third member of her family to die from tuberculosis. Maria appears on the 1850 census as head of the household with 2 male boarders, having lost her husband and her children. Again, we can imagine that Maria must have been supported by her family in this time of grief. A few years later, and some of this is quite confusing, in 1854, Maria was married to George Nye by Reverend James Crawford at the African Baptist Church. She was 39. I don't know anything about George Nye, who disappears from our records. Maria is not listed in the 1860 census. It seems that she was living in New Bedford. The Enquirer reported that her only daughter, Anna Maria Wilkerson, had died at age 8 in that city at 1859. I don't know why the name of her daughter is Wilkerson, how she could possibly have been 8, or what happened to George Nye and who was Wilkerson. Nor can I explain why Anna Maria's date predated her mother's marriage to George Nye. Regardless, it is clear that Maria was twice widowed and had lost all of her children. Maria reappears on Nantucket in the 1870 census as Maria Nye, age 68, listed as a stewardess. She is also recorded in the 1900 census, listed as age 85. Again, ages don't match. The census noted that Maria lived on York Street with her niece, Martha Miller. Her obituary in September 1902 wrote that Maria was, quote, well known to the traveling public as a stewardess, and wrote that Aunt Maria was the last children of James and Maria Pompey Ross. The eldest of the 5 children was James Ross Jr., 15 years older than his sister Eunice. James married Sarah Brown in 1831 at the South Church when he was 23. By 1850, they operated a boarding house valued at $500 and listed in the 1850 census when he was 43. Thus, James was the second person in the Ross family to operate a boarding house. In the Nantucket census of 1855, James and Sarah are listed as having 3 unrelated children in their household, ages 6 to 14. Were these the children of their tenants? Along with his siblings, James Ross Jr. was politically active, his name appearing on several petitions. In 1850, he is listed as a member of the Integrated Vigilance Committee, Nantucket's response to the strict fugitive slave law, part of the Compromise of 1850. Members included Anna Gardner's cousin Edward Gardner, who in 1840 had proposed the first resolution at town meeting to admit all colored children to the high school, all qualified colored children to the high school. In 1857, James Ross Jr. is listed as a member of the Pleasant Street Baptist Church, then under the leadership of Reverend Crawford. The census of 1860 noted that James still owned a boarding house, his worth listed now as $500 and $400. In this census, his wife Sarah is labeled as a mulatto. 10 years later, in 1870, James, age 64, is listed as having no occupation. By 1870, Nantucket's population had plummeted, and there was no clientele for a boarding house, especially in the African American community. Sarah died in 1874, age 65, a widow, and James Ross Jr. died sometime before then. Again, it's not clear. When her brother died, Eunice was in her 40s. James Ross Jr. and Sarah had one child, James Gardner Ross, the third James Ross in his many generations, born in 1844 in the midst of the controversy over his Aunt Eunice. His middle name was probably a tribute to the various Gardners who had helped the African American community in multiple ways. An article about James G. Ross, written decades later, noted that at the age of 13, he converted, baptized into the Baptist religion by Reverend Crawford in 1857, so his dad went to one church and it appears he went to another. The following year, James's father complained to the school committee that his son, then 14, had been, quote, severely punished by J. Bridgman, principal of the West Grammar School. In the 1860 census, James Gardner Ross is listed as a mulatto. 10 years later, the census recorded his worth at $500 and that he was a barber. In 1866, his barber shop is listed in an ad as being at the head of York Street. In 1867, it is listed in Calder's Block, a few doors down from what was the post office. And in 1873, his shop moved yet again, according to an ad which noted he had moved to, quote, new quarters. Following James G. Ross is complicated and merits further research. In just the past 2 weeks, I have found new information about him, of which I am excited, more serendipity. He quit barbering and became a minister sometime in the 1870s. Much of this source material is from an article from a Jacksonville newspaper called the Southern Courier in 1893, which ran a lengthy article about him, which was quoted in the Inquirer and Mirror here. According to it, at some point, James Gardner Ross had lived in Boston and had been licensed to preach. From several sources, we know that it is definitely known that James graduated from the Newton Theological Seminary in 1867. And you can imagine how proud his aunts Eunice, Sarah, and Maria must have been. Both of his parents, unfortunately, had recently died. Nevertheless, he was back on Nantucket, enough to be listed on the annual militia rolls yearly from 1875 to 1880, when at age 36, he disappears from them. The year before he moved away from Nantucket, he spoke at the 3rd anniversary of the Nantucket Union Temperance Society, an integrated group. By this point, the population of Nantucket had dwindled to 4,000 people, with the African-American population just down to 26 individuals, many of them elderly, including his 3 aunts and his cousin Martha. James Gardner Ross joined the legions of young men who left Nantucket. After he left Nantucket, he went to New Haven, Connecticut. To prepare for this talk, I began contacting some of the churches where I have a record of him being. The website of the Emmanuel Church in New Haven lists him as one of their early pastors, but I haven't received any other information from them yet. The Southern Courier wrote that he had stayed in New Haven for about 8 years, but it must be incorrect according to my recent research. James's next posting was to Jacksonville, Florida, where he was living by 1885. I corroborated this on May 29th this year as a result of an email I sent to Adonica Toller, archivist for the Bethel Church and the Eartha M.M. White Historical Museum in Jacksonville. She wrote me back immediately, and since then we've had 2 long phone conversations. I don't know which one of us is the most excited. She sent me new material as well as the first picture we have ever had of James Gardner Ross. I reciprocated by sending the Bethel Church my notes about Reverend Ross and his Nantucket community, and we are about to send a line in the sand to them as well. According to the Bethel records, he stayed there until 1890. While serving their church, he was also appointed by the Florida State Board of Health to travel, lecture, and help meet the health need of churches. So he was really illustrious. Under his leadership, the church built their first parsonage. I hope to visit next spring and meet with Miss Toller and look through the church files. The Bethel Church today is the largest Black Baptist church in Jacksonville and has had only 14 ministers since the Civil War, James G. Ross being one of them. Adonica Toller told me that it has always been an activist church, which fits into the history of the Ross family on the island. According to their archives, James Ross left Bethel and organized the Trinity Baptist Church, which she told me was then only 2 streets away from Bethel and an offshoot of their church. She said that Bethel Church was responsible for over a dozen offshoots. During his time in Jacksonville, James sold his Nantucket house on York Street in 1892, indicating he had no intention of returning to the island. In 1893, the Inquirer noted that Reverend J. Gardner Ross celebrated his 3rd anniversary as the pastor of the Main Street Baptist Church in Jacksonville. 3 different churches, 3 different names. This is confusing. In 1893, the article noted that Reverend Ross was beloved and that over 300 people paid their respects to him with imposing ceremonies and a bountiful banquet. The paper said, to say his pastorate has been a successful one is putting it lightly. and it is the leading Baptist church in the city and the state. I don't know exactly when he left Florida, but definitely by the mid to late 1890s. He is next found in Nashville, preaching there by 1899 because a newspaper there reported that he preached his last sermon at the First Colored Baptist Church there. The Inquirer quoted the Nashville paper, writing, "Reverend J. Gardner Ross is a preacher of force, but yesterday he spoke with unusual feeling and vigor. It noted the church regretted his departure and that the colored people of Nashville have never had his superior in their pulpits. I've reached out to that church too, but have not yet had a response, but I plan to pursue it." By this point in his life, only his sister Martha and his Aunt Maria were alive and living on Nantucket. Of course, we have no idea if these clippings were the only things the family knew of the whereabouts of James G. Ross. I imagine letters were exchanged over the years. From Nashville, I lose James Gardner Ross, age 55. Another mystery that I found no mention of is of a wife, Rosa, who was mentioned at the 1870 census when he was a barber here as a mulatto from St. Helena, the remote Atlantic island where Napoleon lived until his death. What happened to Rosa? I don't know. She's not mentioned in any accounts of his life off island, so I assume that she must have died. To conclude, the original Ross family of James and Mary and their 5 children had no great-grandchildren to carry on their lineage. The last family member we know of, Martha, remained single, and there is no evidence that James Gardner Ross had children. But what is clear is that Eunice Ross had a major impact on our island and on our state in its civil rights history, and that her nephew, James G. Ross, had a major impact on African American churches in Connecticut, Florida, and Tennessee. And I think that's quite a legacy. We have question and answer, but please wait for the mic that Jocelyn will have before you ask so that it goes through the NCTV recording devices. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, can you wait for the microphone? Oh, Adam's going to bring you the microphone.
The color photo you showed of a house on York, what address is that?
Oh, ask me these numbers. 39, I think. It's on the corner of West York and York. It's hard to tell which street it faces. You could put the address on either.
It would have a 39 on it. I could find it.
Yes, it's.
Okay.
I'd have to tell you. If I can email you the.
Okay.
I don't have it off the top of my head. I'm not very numerate.
Okay.
I'm literate, not numerate. Anyone else have any questions over here? Which one, Jocelyn or Adam?
I've got one on the microphone, so I'll start first. No, I was really interested in the passing mention that you made. One of the sisters who had worked as a stewardess,
Yes.
well known as a stewardess, which
On
I
the
assume
steamship.
I assume that's on. You're right, on the ferries.
Right. It's interesting because, Fran's research has shown that Absalom Boston's wife was on the steamship for 40 years. And it's very interesting in this obituary, which I didn't include here, because I'm a little wondering about it, because it said that Maria was a stewardess on the steamship for 40 years, and the numbers just don't compute. So I left that out of my talk.
Yeah, what appealed to me about that is that would be worth further investigation, because we have so few bits of evidence about who's actually working on the steamships at all. And it would make a lot of sense that there's men and women working on the boats.
And two women who would have known each other.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
So I was just very intrigued by that.
But I was a
reference.
little bit suspicious of the 40 years because Maria went off island and on island. I don't know how she could get 40 years in. I had a hard time getting in 30-some years as a teacher, so I don't know. Betsy had a question. Okay. Oh, okay. Her question's being answered, Jocelyn.
I'm just interested in the difference in the way you do research now than you did 10 years ago or 20 years ago in terms of has the internet changed? I mean, or is it, I mean, just...
For sure, the internet has changed things.
Maybe I'd be able to find more information as other organizations.
Yeah, yes and no. A lot of the research in this particular field, you just have to go there. You know, like I connected with Ms. Toller because of the internet site, but then we talked on the phone, but their archives, they're not digitized. So it's yes and no. I would say I was probably a better researcher years ago because that's all I did, whereas now I'm retired. You know, I probably should have started looking at James Ross, you know, a year or two ago. So, yeah. Another question? And down here, Jocelyn, afterwards.
I've often wondered, in the days before black children, children of color on Nantucket, were allowed into the public school system here, did not Quaker ladies like Anna Gardner educate these children of color
That's a wonderful
privately?
question.
And where did they educate them? But they educated them as a group of students of color. This was not an integrated classroom, correct?
Right. That's not a completely easy question to answer, but the black community here, before the public schools, they started their own school. So by 1824, they were building the African Meeting House as a school. Jeffrey Summons, who deeded it to be used as a school forever. But even before that, there's tantalizing evidences like the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel Among Indians and Others, long title. The African Americans here pleaded with them to help them start schools here. And so itinerant preachers came here. There's also, I found, and I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but before Eunice Ross, between her Anna Gardner, between her attending the Moses Brown School in Providence and before she started the African school, a little snippet of evidence that she may have had her own school, and they were usually in the parlors or whatever of their homes. And it says in the particular note that I'm remembering, and I'm not going to know this verbatim, that she taught children who were, I wish I could remember the word, not peculiar, but indicated they were not white children, in my opinion. So, yes, I think so. And even like during the school boycott of, the 1840s, we're pretty sure that education, just like during the pandemic, continued. And we also think that there was a school at the South Church, the Unitarian Church, that was integrated, and possibly during the time of the SPG, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. It's hard to parse these things out until you find some nugget like a diary or something that gives you, so there's a lot of vagueness. Yeah. Which is why people go to historical fiction, right? Let's make it up.
When you first showed her petition, and you said it was misfiled, and is misfiled also that bunch of stuff that fell to the floor?
Yes, all 6 petitions, all the Nantucket petitions were misfiled. The rest of the box had nothing to do with Nantucket. I think it was just, I don't think there was any conspiracy theory. I think it was just carelessness. And now, of course, the archives have moved out to Columbia Point, and they're well aware of what they have, and they're all digitized. I mean, I got to touch them. You couldn't touch them now.
Where are they now?
They're out at Columbia Point at the State Archives by the Kennedy, out there at the Kennedy Museum, which is a wonderful place to go researching, by the way. Any other questions? Oh, we have one down here.
Very informative. I wonder if you can tell us anything about the curriculum in the high school she had trouble getting into, in particular, the English curriculum and what was read.
I don't know what the curriculum was in 1839. I know a little bit because I wrote a book about Cyrus Peirce, who was the first principal of the high school, and I know the kinds of things that he taught. It was wide-ranging, and classics were involved. Math, I didn't bring it with me, I don't have the slide with me, but I have a sample of some of the questions they asked kids about getting into the high school, none of which we could answer today. Like, what oceans and straits and capes would you go to get from Nantucket to the Sandwich Islands and back again? You know, things that, you know, like that. And something about cords of wood and stacking them and how much math, I couldn't have passed it. And then they had some grammar that they had to put the punctuation in properly.
But I take it it was a rigorous curriculum.
You know, it was a high school curriculum it was, I mean, the fact that they had to have an entrance exam to get into it, they did want it to be more than what we would call junior high education. But I'm not really, I don't really know.
At the time of these integration challenges, was the public library segregated?
Well, first of all, it wasn't a public library. It was a private library. The Athenaeum didn't go public until I don't know what date. Fran probably knows. 1900? See, I should be asking Fran these questions. And so it was private, the Athenaeum. So there was a membership. And there was a time when it was where the conventions for the Anti-Slavery Society met, and, you know, Garrison and all those people spoke there. But there were times when they weren't so crazy about that, and so there was a year-long period where the Athenaeum closed its doors to abolition meetings and to people of color. And then Obed Barney, a white abolitionist, started his own lending library on Main Street for anybody, including people of color. Fran, you look like you want to jump in. Do you want to jump into that? No. And so that's a hard question to answer. You know, there wasn't a public library, but for most of its history, yes. You know, I think that you could be a member if you paid your $1 or whatever it was.
I think maybe you don't have the answer, but you said she spoke and learned French. You know any more about why or how?
I do not. I don't know why she, you know, it's such a peculiar thing to end her obituary with, right? And I just think it's marvelous that we know something so concrete about her, since we know so very little about her. You know, I just think about her learning French on her own, or having somebody help her, or maybe she tutored kids in the neighborhood and taught them French. You know, my imagination gets crazy, but that's not history. So. Fran has a question? Oh, comment, good.
Wasn't it the case that Anna Gardner's parents had lived in France for some time?
Yes,
And so
maybe
I
Dunkirk.
think that might well be the line to
Yeah.
Eunice.
I think you're absolutely right. Probably Anna certainly knew French, and maybe that's the line. Wonderful. I make that connection, Fran.
Wasn't Anna Gardner the tutor of Phoebe Boston?
Well, again, we don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. We don't know, you know, we don't even know if Phoebe Ann, for those of you that don't know, Absalom Boston had a daughter who, during a brief time in that contentious 6-year period when the schools weren't integrated, there was this brief year when the abolitionists got onto the school committee, and the first thing they did was integrate the schools. And so the grammar schools, which would be our equivalent of junior high, there were 2 grammar schools, and African-American kids went to them for that time period. And then the abolitionists were voted out soundly, and the segregationists came back in, and those children were publicly ejected from their school in front of their classmates and marched back to the school that the town built on York Street because the black community had refused to let them keep using the meeting house for a segregated school. So Phoebe Ann was one of those kids who was marched out of school, and when the 1845 law passed that said that you could have equal education, Absalom Boston had the means to file a lawsuit. Because just you have to remember that laws have to have some clout. And if a law doesn't have clout, then you rely on somebody to sue. And so Absalom Boston did sue. The town voted at a special town meeting to fight his lawsuit, but then they dropped it, and the integrationists came back in, and there was no reason for the suit. And we think Absalom dropped it, but I've never really it's not something I have found out about myself. So we don't know whether Phoebe Ann went back to the grammar school. She's not listed as a graduate of Nantucket High School, and unfortunately she died at age 21. So that's another sad story.
Thank you. I didn't know that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out and spending your Tuesday evening with us. Thank you, Barbara, for the talk.
Turning
So I just want to invite you all to come to our next lecture, which will be next Wednesday, 5:30, back here at the museum, June 12th. Deborah Sorensen, our Robin and John Davis Curator of Exhibitions, who worked on the Tony Sarg exhibition, will be giving a talk about Tony Sarg. So please join us for that. And if you are interested in attending the graduation ceremony where Eunice Ross will be awarded her posthumous honorary diploma, you can go over to the high school on Friday the 14th, next Friday. Thank you all for joining us.